When I turned 65, I cooked enough food for 11 people and set the dining room table with my best china, but by 8:30 that night, the only sound in the house was the ticking clock above the fireplace and the hum of the refrigerator in my empty kitchen. I kept checking my phone even after the candles had burned down into small pools of wax. At first, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Traffic. Bad weather. Maybe my son Elliot forgot to charge his phone again. I stood near the front window with my hands wrapped around a dish towel, watching headlights pass slowly through our quiet Ohio neighborhood, hoping one of those cars would turn into my driveway. None of them did. The roast I had spent 6 hours preparing sat untouched in the oven, still warm beneath the foil. The mashed potatoes were beginning to dry around the edges. I had even baked Tommy's favorite chocolate cake from scratch because my grandson always asked for extra frosting roses around the sides. I looked at the little blue candles waiting beside the cake and felt something heavy settle into my chest. The table looked beautiful. That was the cruel part. Everything looked ready for a family that had already decided not to come. At 7:15, I called Elliot. Straight to voicemail. At 7:22, I texted Meadow. No response. By 7:40, I had stopped pretending I wasn't being ignored. I sat down slowly in the chair at the head of the table and stared at the empty place cards written in my own handwriting. Elliot. Meadow. Emma. Tommy. Ruth. Carl. For weeks, I had planned this dinner like it mattered. Like I still mattered. Then my phone buzzed beside my plate. For one foolish second, relief rushed through me so quickly my eyes watered. I thought maybe they were finally calling to explain. Instead, it was a Facebook notification. Meadow had posted new photos. I pressed the screen with trembling fingers and there they were. My entire family standing together on the deck of a cruise ship somewhere in the Caribbean. Meadow wore a flowing white sundress and oversized sunglasses, one manicured hand resting on Elliot's chest while the children smiled beside them. Beneath a bright blue sky, even my sister Ruth was there holding a cocktail in one hand. Everyone looked relaxed. Happy. Included. The caption read, "Making unforgettable family memories together." I stared at the words until they blurred. That was when I noticed something else. Emma was wearing the pink sweater I had mailed her last month for her birthday. The one Meadow claimed had never arrived. A strange numbness spread through me then. Not explosive pain. Not anger. Something quieter. Colder. I opened Meadow's profile and scrolled through the rest of the pictures. Sunset dinners. Poolside drinks. Matching family shirts. In every photo, Meadow stood in the center like she was the heart of the family now. Like she had carefully stepped into a space that once belonged to me. I set my phone face down on the table and listened to the silence filling the house around me. The candles flickered weakly beside the untouched cake. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes groaned softly behind the walls. I suddenly realized this feeling wasn't new. This wasn't the first time I had been forgotten. It was only the first time I had stopped making excuses for them. I did not cry that night. I wrapped the leftovers in aluminum foil, scraped untouched frosting into the trash, and carried the heavy serving dishes into the sink one by one while the kitchen grew colder around me. By 10 o'clock, the house smelled like extinguished candles and overcooked roast beef. I remember standing at the counter with my reading glasses still on, staring at the tiny blue sweater folded across the back of a dining chair where I had planned to hand it to Tommy in person. The silence inside the house felt different after that night. Not peaceful. Not lonely either. It felt deliberate. Like something had been removed. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. Elliot used to tease me about that. He would stumble into the kitchen half asleep while I was already making coffee, claiming no human being should be awake before 6 on a Saturday. For 38 years, that kitchen had sounded like marriage. The scrape of his chair across the tile floor. The weather report playing too loudly. From the television. The sound of his spoon tapping against a coffee mug. After he passed away 3 years earlier, the house became painfully quiet, but I still tried to hold the family together the way he would have wanted. Sunday dinners. Christmas breakfasts. Birthday cards mailed exactly on time. I told myself traditions mattered because families needed roots. Now I wondered if I had been the only person still holding on to them. Around 8 that morning, I opened Facebook again. More cruise photos. Meadow smiling beside a pool. Elliot holding Tommy on his shoulders. Emma wrapped in a beach towel, laughing into the camera. I noticed something strange then. In every single picture, Meadow stood in the middle. Even in group shots, everyone angled toward her without seeming to realize it. She looked less like a daughter-in-law and more like the woman directing the entire family. I scrolled farther back through her page. Easter brunch. 4th of July barbecue. Thanksgiving dinner. My stomach tightened slowly. In older photos, I had still been there sometimes. Sitting at the edge of a table. Half visible near a doorway. But over the last 2 years, I began disappearing. First from the center. Then from the frame entirely. There was one Christmas photo where my arm was barely visible near Emma's shoulder, cropped so tightly it looked accidental. Another from Tommy's baseball game where everyone smiled beneath a banner while I stood blurry in the background carrying folding chairs. I remembered that day clearly because Meadow had told me the game started an hour later than it actually did. I arrived after the first inning already ended. At the time, she apologized and blamed a calendar mix-up. I believed her. There was always a reason. Always something small enough to make me question myself instead of her. I leaned back slowly in my chair and stared out the kitchen window at the bare maple tree in my yard. Tiny pieces of memory started fitting together in ways they never had before. Missed invitations. Wrong addresses. Family dinners moved to restaurants without telling me. Group photographs posted online before I even knew everyone had gathered. I used to think. Aging simply made people less necessary, less visible. But sitting there with cold coffee between my hands, I realized something far worse. This had not happened naturally. Someone had been carefully teaching my family how to live without me. 3 days after my birthday, Elliot finally called me while I was folding laundry in the living room. His voice sounded cheerful in the strange forced way people sound when they already know they have done something wrong. He asked how I had been. Not how the party went. Not why I had stopped answering messages. Just a careful little question floating around the real one. I could hear children laughing somewhere behind him and the sharp crash of dishes from a restaurant kitchen. They were still on the cruise. We lost signal for a couple days, he explained before I even asked. Things got hectic. I stood there holding one of Elliot Sr.'s old flannel shirts against my chest while listening to my son lie to me in the gentlest voice possible. The strange thing about betrayal is that sometimes it arrives so politely you almost miss it. I told him I understood. Then I asked how Tommy liked the chocolate cake I made. Silence. Only for a second. But it was enough. Oh, he said quietly. Right. Right. That single word sat heavier in my chest than all the empty chairs had. After we hung up, I carried the folded laundry upstairs and stopped in front of the hallway photo wall. Elliot Sr. built it himself years ago. Walnut frames. Soft yellow lighting above each picture. Birthdays. Graduations. Beach trips. Christmas mornings. At one time, the wall looked like proof that I had built something lasting. Now it felt more like evidence. I studied the photographs slowly. In older pictures, Elliot always stood close beside me with one hand resting lightly against my back. The children leaned toward me naturally. Even Meadow, during those first years, smiled carefully whenever she looked my way. But over time, the distance changed almost invisibly. Meadow moved closer to the center of every picture while I drifted outward little by little like furniture nobody noticed anymore. There was one photograph from Emma's 10th birthday. That stopped me cold. I remembered spending 2 days sewing decorations onto handmade party favors because Meadow said the budget was tight that year. In the photo, everyone crowded together around the cake while I stood in the far corner carrying extra paper plates. No one was looking at me. Not even Emma. I suddenly remembered something else from that day. Meadow had introduced me to one of her friends as Elliot's mother instead of using my name. Such a tiny thing. So small I ignored it at the time. But now the memory returned sharp as broken glass. Over the next hour, more moments surfaced. Thanksgiving dinner moved from my house to Meadows without discussion. Christmas stockings suddenly replaced with matching personalized ones that did not include mine. Family group chats where messages stopped the moment I replied. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed and stared at the hallway through the open door. The house creaked softly around me in the afternoon quiet. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower hummed across the neighborhood. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet something inside me had shifted permanently. For years, I believed I was losing my place because families naturally changed over time. Children grow up. Traditions fade. But this felt different now. Intentional. Structured. Like someone had carefully erased me inch by inch while smiling directly at my face the entire time. And the worst part was realizing how many people had quietly allowed it to happen. The following Sunday, my sister Ruth stopped by unexpectedly with a grocery store pie balanced awkwardly in her hands and guilt written all over her face. I noticed it the second I opened the front door. People think guilt looks dramatic. Usually it does not. Usually it looks like avoiding eye contact while pretending everything is normal. Ruth stepped inside slowly, commenting on the weather too quickly, her smile tight around the edges. I led her into the kitchen while the coffee brewed between us in strained silence. She kept adjusting the sleeves of her cardigan the way she always did when something bothered her. Finally, after several long minutes, she looked down at the table and sighed. Softly. Loretta, she said, I did not know they had not told you about the trip. I stirred cream into my coffee without answering. The spoon tapped lightly against the mug. Small. Controlled. Ruth swallowed hard. Meadows said you did not want to travel anymore, she continued quietly. She told everyone you preferred staying home because cruises were too exhausting for you now. I let out a slow breath through my nose. Of course she had. The lie was almost elegant because it sounded thoughtful instead of cruel. Meadow never attacked directly. She rearranged reality carefully until people stopped questioning her version of it. Ruth finally looked up at me then, and for the first time in days, somebody saw the truth on my face. Oh, Loretta, she whispered. I think this has been going on longer than any of us realized. Outside the kitchen window, wind moved through the maple branches in dry rattling waves. I stared at the untouched pie sitting between us and suddenly remembered another afternoon almost 2 years earlier. Emma had invited me to her middle school choir concert. I bought a new lavender blouse for the occasion and arrived 30 minutes early carrying flowers. I waited in the auditorium alone while families filled the rows around me. Then I checked my phone and found a text from Meadow sent only 10 minutes before the concert started. Wrong school. Wrong address. By the time I reached the correct building across town, the concert was already ending. Emma smiled politely when she saw me, but Meadow only shrugged and said, Technology can be confusing sometimes. I remember apologizing to her that night. Apologizing. Ruth slowly shook her head while I told her the story. Loretta, that was not confusion, she said carefully. And honestly, there were comments during the cruise that made me uncomfortable. I looked at her quietly over the rim of my coffee mug. Ruth hesitated before continuing. One night at dinner, Meadow joked that family vacations felt lighter without guilt trips and old-fashioned expectations. My fingers tightened slightly around the warm ceramic cup. Nobody said anything? I asked. Ruth looked ashamed. People laughed. Awkwardly, she admitted. Elliot looked down at his plate. Something inside me settled then. Not shattered. Settled. Like dust finally reaching the floor after years floating unseen through sunlight. I thought back to all the moments Elliot avoided conflict by staying silent. The little uncomfortable smiles. The subject changes. The lowered eyes. Meadow may have orchestrated the distance, but my son had allowed it to grow because confronting her required more courage than disappointing me. Ruth reached across the table and touched my hand gently. You are not imagining this, she said softly. I nodded once and looked toward the hallway where family photographs still lined the walls like memories from another woman's life. Deep down, I think I had known the truth for a very long time. I had simply loved my family too much to name it out loud. After Ruth left, I walked slowly through the house, turning off lights that did not need to be on. The living room lamp beside Elliot Sr.'s recliner. The hallway light near the laundry room. The little fixture above the stove that always flickered during winter. I moved quietly, almost carefully, as though I might disturb something fragile if I made too much noise. By evening, rain had started tapping softly against the windows, and the entire neighborhood disappeared behind a gray curtain of mist. I made myself a bowl of canned soup and carried it into the den, but I never touched it. Instead, I opened Facebook again. This time, I looked differently. Not like a mother searching for connection. Like a woman studying evidence. Meadows' page unfolded in front of me like a carefully edited scrapbook of the perfect American family. Matching pajamas at Christmas. Coordinated outfits during apple orchard trips. Smiling photographs beside restaurant patios strung with warm lights. Everything looked effortless. Warm. Curated. But once I stopped looking at what Meadow wanted people to see, I noticed the patterns hiding underneath. In older pictures, there were traces of me everywhere. My hand passing a serving dish across a table. My purse hanging from a chair in the corner. The sleeve of my sweater beside Emma during Thanksgiving dinner. Then slowly, year after year, those traces vanished. It reminded me of watching shoreline disappear from a boat without realizing how far you have drifted until land is already gone. I clicked through albums from previous holidays and began noticing details I once ignored. A Mother's Day brunch where every woman at the table received flowers except me. A 4th of July cookout where Meadow captioned a photograph, finally creating our own traditions. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Families evolve. Young couples build their own lives. That is what I told myself. But now every post carried a second meaning beneath the cheerful surface. Meadow was not simply building new traditions. She was replacing old ones. Replacing me. I paused on one photograph taken last Thanksgiving. Everyone stood together in Meadow's kitchen smiling beside a golden turkey while soft autumn decorations covered the counters. I remembered arriving 40 minutes late that day because Meadow texted me the wrong dinner time. Again. In the photo, there was no empty seat waiting for me. No place setting. They had already eaten. I remember Meadow touching my arm lightly and saying, "Oh no, did I send the wrong time again?" Then she laughed softly as though it were adorable. Elliot avoided my eyes while carving pie at the counter. I zoomed closer into the picture now and noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Emma looked uncomfortable. Not guilty exactly. Sad. Children notice more than adults realize. Another memory surfaced then. Last spring during Emma's school fundraiser, I overheard Meadow speaking to another parent near the refreshment table. Older people can become emotionally dependent, she said quietly while glancing in my direction. Sometimes boundaries are healthier for everyone. I remember smiling politely at the time because I did not understand the insult hidden inside the concern. Sitting alone in the den while rain pressed softly against the windows, I finally understood Meadow's greatest talent. She never looked cruel. She looked reasonable. Caring even. She had spent years turning my exclusion into something that sounded practical, healthy, modern. And because she smiled while doing it, everyone else learned to accept it too. 2 days later, I went upstairs to clean out the linen closet because I could not stand sitting in that silent house any longer. The closet was narrow and overstuffed the way old family homes tend to become after decades of life collecting inside them. Extra blankets. Board games missing pieces. Stacks of yellowed greeting cards tied together with ribbon. Near the back of the top shelf, behind an old sewing basket, I found a small cedar box that belonged to Elliot Sr. I had not opened it since the week after his funeral. Dust coated the lid in a thin grey layer. For a long moment, I simply stood there holding it against my chest while memories moved through me slowly and painfully. Elliot was the kind of man who fixed things quietly. Loose cabinet hinges. Flat tires. Burned out porch lights. He believed love lived in practical gestures, not dramatic speeches. Even during the final months of his illness, he still insisted on taking out the trash every Tuesday night because he said routines kept people grounded. I carried the cedar box downstairs and placed it carefully on the dining room table beneath the soft afternoon light. Inside were old photographs, warranty receipts, 2 fountain pens, and several folded letters held together with a rubber band that had grown brittle with age. I recognized Elliot's handwriting immediately. Strong. Slanted slightly to the right. Near the bottom of the box sat a plain white envelope with my name written across the front. Loretta. Nothing else. My throat tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note dated almost 18 months before he passed away. If you are reading this, it began, then I was probably right to worry. I sat down slowly. Outside, rainwater still dripped steadily from the gutters after the previous night's storm. Elliot wrote that he had noticed changes in the family long before I did. He mentioned cancelled visits. Awkward silences during holidays. The way Meadow often answered questions directed at Elliot before he could speak for himself. One sentence made my chest ache sharply. You always see the best in people, Loretta. That is one of the reasons I loved you. But not everyone deserves unlimited understanding. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the paper and closed my eyes briefly. Elliot had seen it. All of it. Even back then. Beneath the note rested another sealed envelope. This one thicker. Inside was a folded laboratory document from a private DNA testing company dated nearly 4 years earlier. My pulse slowed strangely as I unfolded the pages. I read the results once. Then again more carefully. The words blurred slightly before settling into place with terrible clarity. Elliot Sr. had requested a paternity test involving Tommy. The result stated there was no biological relationship between Elliot Jr. and the child they were raising as his son. For several seconds, the entire room became unnaturally still. I could hear the old wall clock ticking near the staircase. Water dripping outside. My own breathing. Nothing else. At the bottom of the envelope, Elliot had written another note in blue ink. I never told Elliot because I hoped the truth would not destroy him. But if Meadow ever turns this family against you completely, you deserve to know who you are really dealing with. I stared at the papers spread across the dining room table where 11 untouched place settings had sat only days earlier. Suddenly every carefully controlled smile Meadow ever gave me looked different in my memory. Not confident. Calculated. I leaned back slowly in my chair and folded the documents with steady hands. For the first time since my birthday, I was no longer sitting alone with confusion. I was sitting with the truth. The family returned from the cruise the following Thursday evening. I knew because Meadow immediately began posting photographs from the airport before their luggage had probably even reached baggage claim. Matching sweatshirts. Smiling children. Elliot pushing a suitcase while Meadow balanced an expensive coffee in one hand like some polished lifestyle commercial. I watched the pictures appear one after another while sitting alone in my quiet den with Elliot's letters folded neatly beside me on the table. Something strange had changed inside me over the past few days. The ache was still there, but the confusion was gone. Pain without confusion feels different. Cleaner somehow. Around 6:30, my phone rang. Meadow's name lit up across the screen for the first time in months. I answered calmly. Her voice flowed warm and sweet immediately, almost rehearsed. Loretta, we are finally home, she said brightly. We missed you so much. I stared toward the rain-darkened backyard through the kitchen window while listening to her words settle like oil across water. Missed me. The same woman who watched my 65th birthday pass without a single phone call now sounded offended by distance she created herself. I am glad you all made it home safely, I replied. There was a tiny pause on the line. Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for Meadow. She was waiting for emotion. Hurt. Accusation. Something she could redirect or dismiss. Instead, I gave her nothing. Well, she continued lightly, we thought maybe everyone could come by Sunday for dinner. Casual family night. Casual. As though families simply forgot birthdays now. As though exclusion happened naturally like bad weather. I agreed without hesitation. That seemed to surprise her most of all. Sunday arrived grey and chilly. By late afternoon, The house smelled like rosemary chicken and buttered rolls warming in the oven. I dressed carefully in a soft cream sweater Elliot once said made me look elegant. Not for them. For myself. At exactly 5:12, Meadow swept through my front door carrying a paper gift bag covered in tropical flowers. Happy belated birthday, she sang dramatically before air-kissing my cheek. The children rushed past her into the living room while Elliot followed behind carrying wine bottles and avoiding direct eye contact. Meadow handed me the bag with a smile polished so perfectly it almost deserved admiration. Inside was a cheap souvenir keychain shaped like a flamingo and a refrigerator magnet that read Caribbean Queen. We saw it and thought of you, she laughed. Ruth arrived a few minutes later and immediately went quiet the moment she saw Meadow. I noticed everything now. The way Meadow positioned herself at the center of conversations. The way Elliot looked toward her before answering simple questions. The way Emma watched the room carefully whenever tension shifted beneath the surface. During dinner, Meadow scrolled through Crew's photos on her phone while narrating every detail loudly across the table. This was the adults-only dinner night, she said with a bright smile. It was nice having freedom for once. Her eyes flicked toward me very briefly when she said it. Elliot focused hard on cutting his chicken into tiny pieces. Tommy laughed at something on his tablet without understanding any of it. I sat quietly at the head of the table listening to forks scrape softly against plates while warm light glowed above us. To anyone outside the family, it probably looked perfectly normal. Comfortable even. That was Meadow's real talent. She created cruelty so subtle it blended into ordinary life. Halfway through dessert, she reached across the table and touched my wrist gently. You have been awfully quiet tonight, Loretta, she said with careful concern. I hope you are not still upset about the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. I looked directly into her eyes for the first time in years without doubting myself. Then I smiled softly and folded my napkin beside my plate. No, I said calmly. I am finally starting to understand things very clearly. For the first time all evening, Meadow stopped smiling. Dessert plates still sat half full on the table when I stood up quietly and walked toward the hallway cabinet near the staircase. Nobody paid much attention at first. Meadow continued talking about the cruise ship spa packages while Tommy played games on his tablet and Emma pushed melting ice cream around her bowl with a spoon. The ordinary sounds of family dinner filled the room softly. Glasses clinking. Silverware scraping porcelain. Elliot laughing too quickly at something Meadow said. I opened the cabinet drawer slowly and removed the plain manila envelope I had placed there earlier that afternoon. The paper felt heavier now than it had upstairs in my bedroom. For one brief moment, I considered putting it back. Not because Meadow deserved protection. Because Elliot did. Then I remembered the empty dining room on my birthday. The untouched cake. The photographs cropped so carefully over the years. Some truths arrive late because people spend years trying not to see them. I returned to the table calmly and placed the envelope beside my plate. Meadow noticed first. Her eyes flicked downward for only a second before the smile returned to her face. What is that? She asked lightly. I folded my hands together. Something Elliot Sr. left behind, I said. The room shifted almost imperceptibly after that. Elliot looked up slowly from his wineglass. Ruth stopped moving entirely. Even Emma glanced between us with sudden unease. Meadow laughed softly under her breath. This sounds serious, she joked, though her voice no longer sounded relaxed. I slid the envelope gently across the table toward Elliot. Your father wanted you to have it if certain things ever became clear, I said quietly. Elliot frowned as he opened the flap. The room had grown so still I could hear the refrigerator humming behind us in the kitchen. He unfolded the laboratory papers slowly at first, confusion passing across his face before draining away completely. I watched the exact moment his breathing changed. Meadow leaned toward him immediately. What is that supposed to be? She asked sharply. Elliot did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the page while all the color disappeared from his face inch by inch. Elliot. Meadow's voice rose slightly now. Ruth looked down at her lap as though she already understood. I sat quietly with my hands resting in front of me while years of manipulation finally collided with something stronger than performance. Facts do not care about charm. Elliot finally lifted his eyes toward Meadow with an expression I had never seen on my son before. Not anger exactly. Devastation. "Tell me this is wrong," he said softly. Meadow stared at him for several long seconds without speaking. Then she laughed once in disbelief. "Are you seriously doing this right now?" she snapped. "In front of the children?" Tommy looked up from his tablet, confused by the sudden tension in the room. Emma had gone. Completely pale. Meadow reached toward the papers, but Elliot pulled them back instinctively. "Dad did this?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. Meadow turned toward me then, and for the first time since I had known her, the polished mask slipped completely. The sweetness vanished from her face like lights shutting off inside a house. "You kept this," she whispered. "For years." I held her gaze steadily. "No," I replied. "Your father-in-law did." Silence settled heavily across the dining room. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for dessert anymore. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows while the porch light cast pale yellow reflections across the dark yard. Meadow looked around the table as though searching for control she could no longer find. But something fundamental had shifted now. The room no longer revolved around her version of reality. Elliot lowered his head slowly into his hands while the papers trembled slightly between his fingers. And for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer the invisible person sitting at the edge of my own family. Meadow was the first person to stand up from the table. Her chair scraped sharply across the hardwood floor before she caught herself and forced her voice back under control. "This is ridiculous," she said tightly while smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sweater. "A private test from years ago does not prove anything." But nobody answered her immediately. That was the part she was not prepared for. Silence. People who manipulate families survive by controlling emotional direction. Deflecting. Redirecting. Making everyone rush to calm the tension before truth has time to settle. But no one moved to rescue her now. Elliot remained frozen in his chair staring down at the papers like they were written in another language. Ruth quietly guided Tommy toward the living room under the excuse of finding dessert while Emma lingered uncertainly near the hallway, pale and frightened in a way children become when adults suddenly stop pretending. Meadow looked toward Elliot again. "Say something," she demanded softly. He finally lifted his eyes, but they did not carry anger. That almost made it worse. He looked exhausted. Like a man replaying years of conversations inside his head all at once. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. Meadow crossed her arms tightly. "I knew your father hated me," she snapped. "That is what I know." Elliot lowered the papers carefully onto the table as though sudden movement might break something already damaged beyond repair. "That is not what I asked." The dining room light cast soft shadows across everyone's faces while the untouched pie from earlier sat between us like part of another evening entirely. Meadow's confidence kept slipping in small visible fractures now. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted toward me repeatedly. Not with guilt. With resentment. Because in her mind, I had disrupted the version of reality she spent years constructing. "You planned this," she whispered toward me. "You waited for the perfect moment to humiliate me." I looked at her calmly across the table. "No, Meadow," I said quietly. "You humiliated yourself long before tonight." Her face tightened instantly. For years, I would have softened after saying something like that. I would have apologized for being harsh. Tried to smooth things over. But something inside me had finally stopped bending. Elliot pushed his chair back slowly and stood up from the table. He looked older suddenly. Not physically. Spiritually. Like trust itself had weight and he had just discovered how much of it he had been carrying blindly. Emma moved toward him carefully and slipped her hand into his. He held it automatically without taking his eyes off Meadow. "I need air," he said quietly before walking toward the front door. Meadow stared after him in disbelief. The house fell silent again except for the faint ticking of the wall clock near the staircase. I looked around the dining room one final time. The polished silverware. Half-empty glasses. Folded napkins beside untouched dessert plates. A week earlier, I would have done anything to keep this family together at any cost to myself. But families built on one person shrinking smaller and smaller are not really families at all. They are performances. I stood slowly and reached for my cardigan draped across the back of the chair. Meadow watched me carefully now, but the certainty she once carried so effortlessly was gone. "Where are you going?" she asked quietly. I slipped my arms into the sweater and picked up my car keys from the counter. "Out," I answered simply. Then I paused near the doorway and looked back toward the dining room where everyone still sat surrounded by the remains of another carefully staged family evening. For years, I thought loneliness was the worst thing that could happen to a woman my age. I was wrong. The worst thing is becoming invisible inside your own life while begging people to notice your pain politely enough not to inconvenience them. I opened the front door and cool night air rushed softly into the house. Somewhere down the street, porch lights glowed warmly against the dark Ohio evening. Behind me, nobody spoke. And for the first time in years, walking away did not feel like losing my family. It felt like finally finding myself again.